Have you ever stopped to think about something like uh, the legal drinking age? Something we all sort of assume we understand. But then maybe you wondered if the actual data, the real story behind it, is maybe more complex. Perhaps even, well, surprising than what we usually hear. Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. We're doing a deep dive into underage drinking and the minimum legal drinking age, the MLDA laws.
Yeah, and our goal here, our mission, if you like, is really to get past the assumptions. We want to deliver the key facts. We'll look at the history, where these laws came from, check out the evidence for how effective they actually are, drawing on sources like the CDC and lots of scientific reviews, and we'll even touch on the debates that still pop up. The idea is that by the end, you'll have a really clear picture of why we have these laws and the actual impact they make.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, let's start with maybe a surprising fact. What's something key about underage drinking that might make people pause?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing, and maybe it is surprising, is that alcohol is still the most common drug used by people under 21 in the U.S.
Wow, the most common drug. That really frames it differently, doesn't it? And the human cost.
Yeah.
It's just devastating.
It really is. We're looking at around 4,000 young people under 21 dying every year in the U.S. because of excessive drinking. And the tragic part is, these are largely preventable deaths. Lives just cut short.
Absolutely heartbreaking. And beyond that human cost, there's this other angle that's often missed, the financial side. It's huge. Back in 2010, underage drinking cost the U.S. economy something like, what, $24 billion?
That's right, $24 billion. And you have to figure with inflation, healthcare costs going up, public safety, that number is almost certainly much, much higher today.
It's staggering. And the consequences, they ripple outwards, right? It's not just about fatality.
Exactly. The consequences are really multifaceted. Underage drinking makes risky behaviors much more likely, which leads to all sorts of injuries. You see real impacts on young people's lives, things like more school absences, lower grades, and critically, a much higher chance of drinking and driving. Just think, about 60% of high schoolers say they've ridden with a drunk driver.
16%.
Yeah, and 5% admit they've driven after drinking themselves. Plus, there's misuse of other drugs, prescription or illicit, and the combined health effects when mixed with alcohol.
That connection to immediate dangerous choices is clear, but what about the sort of slower burn, the longer-term health stuff?
Right. The physical and mental health impacts are serious, too. It contributes to violence, homicide, suicide, sexual violence, injuries from crashes, obviously, but also burns, falls, drowning. It can actually impair growth and slow down brain development.
Slow brain development.
Yes, leading to things like memory problems. And there are links to higher rates of STIs, HIV, unplanned pregnancies, often because of unprotected sex, and maybe one of the most crucial long-term risks. Starting drinking earlier significantly increases the chance of developing excessive drinking habits or even alcohol use disorder later in life.
That really paints a sobering picture, the sheer scale of the cost, personal and economic. You know, looking at the current situation, there are some recent trends in youth drinking that are quite surprising. While overall drinking and binge drinking, that's usually defined as, what, 5 or more drinks in one go?
Correct. Typically 5 or more for males, 4 or more for females, within about 2 hours.
Right. So while that's generally gone down among high school students over the last few decades, which is good news, we're seeing this really interesting kind of unexpected reversal. For the first time, actually, more high school girls are reporting drinking alcohol and binge drinking than high school boys.
That's a significant shift, reversing long-standing patterns.
It really is. And just for context, about 9% of high school students overall said they'd binged in the past month.
And another really important factor here is parental influence. It's huge. When parents drink, especially binge drink, it significantly ups the odds that their kids will drink too. There was one study showing that adolescents whose parents drank, say, 5 or more days a month, they were much more likely to drink themselves. It really highlights the environment they're in.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and trace the history of the MLDA itself. To understand today, we kind of need to look back, right? Back to after Prohibition.
Exactly. After Prohibition ended, things settled for a while, and almost all states set the legal drinking age at 21. That was the norm.
But then the 70s happened.
Right. The 70s brought a really big change. Between 1970 and 1975, you had 29 states actually lower their MLDA down to 18, 19, or 20. It often happened alongside other age limit changes, like the voting age dropping to 18. Suddenly, you had this patchwork across the country.
And the result? It wasn't good, was it? Scientists saw something pretty quickly.
They did. Almost immediately, researchers started seeing a really clear, significant increase in traffic crashes involving teenagers in those states that had lowered the age.
Which was especially terrifying because
Because traffic crashes were already the #1 killer for that age group. So this spike was incredibly alarming. The data was stark.
so that data sparked a reaction.
A very strong one.
Yeah.
You had citizen advocacy groups mobilizing. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, is probably the most famous, but there were others too. They really rallied public support, pushing hard to get the MLDA back up to 21 nationwide.
Now, the federal government couldn't just order the states to change it, right?
Yeah,
Because of the 21st Amendment.
Correct. The 21st Amendment gives states the primary control over alcohol regulation. So a direct federal mandate wasn't really feasible.
But they found another way, a pretty clever one, actually.
They did. In 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, sometimes called the Uniform Drinking Age Act. It basically incentivized states. It said, raise your MLDA back to 21 by 1987, or you'll lose a portion of your federal highway funding.
Ah, the power of the purse.
Precisely. And it worked. By 1988, every single state and D.C. had raised their MLDA back to 21. It's actually a pretty remarkable example of how scientific evidence, combined with strong public advocacy, can really shape national policy.
Okay, so we've seen the history, the back and forth, the policy moves. But the huge question is, does it actually work? Does having the MLDA at 21 make a real difference? And this isn't just guesswork, is it? You mentioned studies.
Oh, absolutely not guesswork. The MLDA 21 policy is probably the single most studied alcohol control policy we have. There are over 70 rigorous scientific studies looking at its effects, going all the way back to those changes in the 70s.
70 studies. Okay, so what does all that research tell us about, say, just overall drinking levels among young people?
The evidence is really consistent and pretty compelling. When states lowered the drinking age, youth alcohol use went up, period. And conversely, when the age was raised back to 21, youth drinking went down. It's a very clear pattern.
Can you put some numbers on that decrease?
Sure. For instance, between 1985 and 1991, which is right after the nationwide push for MLDA 21 solidified, the percentage of 18 to 20-year-olds reporting any drinking in the past month, it dropped significantly. Went from about 59% down to 40%. That's nearly a 20% drop in a relatively short time.
Wow. What about that argument you sometimes hear, the rubber band effect? That maybe kids just hold off and then drink more when they finally turn 21 to make up for it.
Yeah, that's a common theory, but the research just doesn't support it. In fact, it shows the opposite. Having the MLDA at 21 leads to lower drinking rates among those under 21. And importantly, those lower rates tend to persist even after they turn 21 and into their early 20s. There's actually evidence suggesting that having earlier legal access, like at age 18, is linked to higher rates of drinking later in life, not lower. So the making up for lost time idea is pretty much debunked by the data.
That's a really crucial finding. Okay, so lower overall drinking. What about the impact that really sparked the change in the first place, traffic safety?
The impact there is perhaps even more dramatic and clear-cut. Most of the studies looking at what happened when states lowered the MLDA showed clear increases in crashes and traffic deaths among young people.
And when they raised it back up?
The reverse happened. Out of 29 studies that specifically evaluated the effects of increasing the MLDA back to 21, 20 of them found statistically significant decreases in traffic crashes and deaths for that age group.
20 out of 29 showing significant decreases. That's strong.
Very strong. And NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, put a number on it. They estimated that in 1987 alone, just 1 year raising the MLDA to 21 prevented about 1,071 traffic deaths.
Over 1,000 lives saved in just 1 year because of this law.
Yes. And if you look long-term, since 1982, which is around when the push for MLDA 21 really gained steam, alcohol-related traffic fatalities among 16 to 20-year-olds have plummeted. They've declined by an incredible 79%. 79%.
That is just staggering, a huge public health victory.
It really is. And the benefits don't stop at traffic safety, which is important to remember. A higher MLDA is also linked to lower rates of other problems connected to alcohol, things like vandalism. Some states saw like a 16% decrease. It's also associated with fewer deaths from suicides, fewer pedestrian accidents involving alcohol, other types of injuries.
So it's a broader safety net.
Exactly. Fewer harmful births related to alcohol, lower rates of homicide, fewer deaths from acute alcohol poisoning. It's a policy with really wide-ranging positive public health effects.
Okay, this all paints a picture of a remarkably effective policy. Lives saved, fewer injuries, lower drinking rates. But now comes maybe the most, counterintuitive part of this whole story. Despite all this proven success, you're saying it's happened with surprisingly little enforcement.
That's the paradox, isn't it? It's a policy that works incredibly well, statistically speaking, yet enforcement has historically been, well, lacking in many ways. Consider this. Studies have shown that minors, even those who look obviously younger than 21, can often buy alcohol from stores or bars without being carded, sometimes succeeding in 50% or more of their attempts.
Half the time. Wow.
Yeah, but maybe even more significantly, most underage drinkers don't get their alcohol from licensed sellers. They get it socially, from friends who are over 21, older siblings, sometimes parents, coworkers, even strangers they might ask outside a store. That's a huge channel that's harder to control.
So if the policy is so effective, why isn't enforcement stronger? I mean, if merchants know they can often get away with selling to minors.
Well, that survey figure you mentioned earlier is telling. Only 38% of alcohol merchants thought it was even likely they'd get cited for selling to a minor. There's a perception of low risk.
And where does the enforcement focus tend to fall?
Often, disproportionately on the kids themselves. Penalties for underage possession are far more common than penalties against the adults or businesses that actually provide the alcohol illegally. The numbers are pretty stark. For every 1,000 minors arrested for alcohol possession, you only see action taken against about 130 establishments and maybe 88 individual adults who provided the alcohol.
That ratio seems way off.
It does, and this figure is even more shocking. Estimates suggest that only about 5 out of every 100,000 times a minor drinks does it actually result in any kind of consequence, like a fine or license suspension for the place that sold or served them the alcohol.
5 in 100,000. That's basically no enforcement against the providers. Why so low? Why aren't agencies doing more?
Well, agencies often cite a few reasons. Sometimes it's a perception that the community kind of accepts underage drinking, or at least doesn't actively push for stricter enforcement against providers. Sometimes there's just a lack of resources, staffing, funding allocated specifically for this kind of compliance work.
Well, we know it does work to improve compliance, right?
Absolutely. Increased enforcement against those illegal providers makes a big difference. Things like sting operations, where supervised underage individuals attempt to buy alcohol. Those have been shown to dramatically cut down illegal sales. One study showed sales to minors dropped from nearly 60% down to 26% within a year after stings were implemented.
So targeted enforcement works. What else?
Institutional policies within the alcohol establishments themselves are key. Things like mandatory responsible beverage server training, teaching staff how to check IDs properly, how to refuse sales politely but firmly. Also, management monitoring servers, making sure policies are followed, and even just posting clear warning signs about the consequences of selling to minors. These things add up. It's interesting, though, despite all this evidence piling up over decades, the debate isn't completely over. You still see some states occasionally considering lowering the MLDA, and legal challenges pop up. There was one in Louisiana, for example, arguing age discrimination.
How did that turn out?
The Louisiana Supreme Court ultimately upheld the MLDA of 21. They basically concluded that, yes, it differentiates based on age, but it substantially furthers the important government goal of improving highway safety, and therefore it's constitutional. Public safety won out.
Okay, so let's tackle some of those recurring arguments against the MLDA directly. We have the evidence. Let's address the counterpoints. First one, it infringes on states' rights. How do we respond to that?
Well, two key things there. First, as we discussed, the federal government incentivized the change with funding. It didn't mandate it directly. States still made the final choice. And second, a huge part of the push for MLDA 21 came from the ground up from citizen groups, reflecting strong public will. And even today, polls consistently show that the vast majority of the public supports keeping the drinking age at 21.
Okay, next argument. Look at Europe. They have lower drinking ages and they seem fine. What's the flaw in that comparison?
Yeah, the Europe comparison comes up constantly, but it's not really an apples-to-apples situation. First, European countries do have significant alcohol-related problems, sometimes similar or even higher rates of things like liver cirrhosis from alcohol. Second, when people point to lower youth drunk driving rates there, they often overlook other major differences. Like in many European countries, the legal driving age is older, cars are less affordable for young people, and there's way more access to good public transportation.
Ah, so other factors are reducing drunk driving, not necessarily the drinking age itself?
Exactly. Those factors play a huge role. And interestingly, because the evidence for MLDA 21 in the U.S. is so strong, some European countries are actually looking at our experience now and debating whether they should potentially raise their own drinking ages.
That's fascinating. Okay, what about the emotional argument? If you're old enough to serve in the military, fight and die for your country, you should be old enough to buy a beer.
It's a powerful argument, emotionally, absolutely. But the logic relies on equating all adult rights and responsibilities, which we don't actually do in practice. Think about it.
Yeah.
You can drive at 16, vote, and join the military at 18, but you have to be 21 to buy a handgun from a licensed dealer in many places and 35 to run for president.
Right, different ages for different things based on risk and maturity.
Precisely. The age limits are set based on the specific requirements, the risks involved, and the potential benefits or harms associated with that particular activity. And critically, the scientific evidence shows that brains are still developing into the early 20s, and younger people tend to be more impaired by alcohol than older adults at the same blood alcohol level. So restricting access under 21 reduces known risks, not just to the young person, but to society.
Okay, another one. Some argue the drop in crashes wasn't really due to the MLDA, but just because of increased general drunk driving enforcement that happened around the same time.
Researchers have specifically looked at that, and the analyses consistently show that while general enforcement certainly helps, the decline in alcohol-related crashes among 18 to 20-year-olds was directly linked to their lower rates of drinking after the MLDA was raised. You can statistically separate the effect of the MLDA from the effect of general enforcement, and the MLDA effect is significant and independent. Lower consumption led to fewer crashes in that specific age group.
Got it. And just to hammer it home one last time, that rubber band effect, the idea that kids just drink more heavily later.
Still a myth.
Yeah.
The research is very clear. People who grow up with an MLDA of 21 drink less before 21, and they tend to continue drinking less into their early 20s compared to those in places with lower drinking ages. There's no compensatory binge effect shown in the data. If anything, early legal access seems to correlate with more problem drinking later on.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, after diving deep into the history, the data, the debates, what's the core takeaway?
I think the clearest message is that the minimum legal drinking age of 21 is not just some arbitrary number. It's a public health policy grounded in decades of solid scientific evidence. The benefits are clear and measurable. It reduces alcohol consumption among young people, and most importantly, it saves thousands of lives and prevents countless injuries every year.
And it highlights the power of certain types of policies, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows that these kinds of environmental strategies, changing the context in which people make choices, like regulating availability, can be incredibly effective, often more so than just focusing on individual education or treatment programs alone, especially for creating broad, long-term change in population behavior like youth drinking.
So thinking about that paradox you mentioned, this incredibly effective policy achieving so much despite relatively weak enforcement against those providing the alcohol, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Imagine the potential impact if we actually had more consistent, targeted enforcement focused on preventing illegal sales and provision to minors alongside greater public awareness. It really raises a question for all of us, for you listening. Given how much good this law already does, what steps could we, maybe in our own communities, take to support better enforcement and protect young people even more effectively? Something to think about.